Hello, everybody. It's Walter, your favorite historian, educator, professor, social studies extraordinaire, and blue collar scholar. Today's date is December 2nd, 2025. This video is entitled Thurgood Marshall Should Have Retired Under President Reagan. Thurgood Marshall, of course, made history in 1967 by becoming the Supreme Court's first African American member. Appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson upon the retirement of Justice Tom Clark, Marshall would serve on the court from 1967 until his retirement in 1991. Now, Marshall, obviously being a very liberal man in his legal and political views, had sought to be replaced by a like-minded successor. Now, during the years that he served on the Supreme Court, you only had two Democratic presidents who would have been able to fulfill that obligation. Lyndon B. Johnson, who appointed him to the court, and Jimmy Carter, who served between 1977 and 1981. After Johnson, Marshall had only been on the court for 10 years by 1977 and thus was not ready to go at that early stage. But one could argue that roughly as early as 1984, 85, when he was in his late 70s at that point, Marshall was ready to go, okay? But unfortunately, Ronald Reagan, a Republican, was in the White House. And Marshall once said that Reagan was the worst president of his lifetime, even though I have to wonder just how true that was, considering he lived during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who was far worse on so many levels. But in any case, I make the argument that Marshall should have stepped down under Reagan instead of when he did under President George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, Marshall hung on literally, vainly, all right, past the 1984 election when Reagan was reelected, and the 1988 election, okay, when George H.W. Bush was elected, okay. He hung on literally as long as he could to his seat on the Supreme Court, hoping that a Democrat would be elected president so that he could get a liberal successor. It was not to happen. Of course, he stepped down in June of 1991 when he literally had to go. I mean, by that point, he was 83 years old. His eyesight was failing. His body was failing in so many ways. As a matter of fact, at his retirement press conference, the reporter asked him, "Mr. Justice, why are you stepping down?" He replied in classic Marshall format, "Because I'm getting old and coming apart." All right. Again, his health was failing, and he was no longer up to the task of being a Supreme Court justice, nor even had the appearance of being able to stay up to the task. So he should have stepped down under Reagan for the following reasons. First and foremost, under Reagan in the 1980s, black conservatives, okay, were a white buffalo, if you will. Okay, they were very few and far in between, very hard to find, especially those well established and well distinguished in the legal community. Reagan, obviously not wanting to return the court to its pre-Marshall lily-white composition, would have had no choice but to likely nominate a much more moderate black person to replace Marshall. Obviously very different than Clarence Thomas. He would have, from what I've read in a Reagan biography, he had federal judge Damon Keith on reserve to replace Marshall in case the former stepped down during his presidency, which of course did not happen. So that's the first reason. Okay, Reagan would have had to appoint someone much more moderate because black conservatives were very few and far in between in the 1980s. Next, his replacement guaranteed would not have been Clarence Thomas. In the 1980s, Clarence Thomas was working in a litany of other different legal positions. Senator John Danforth, he was working as a law professor and later on became a judge on the D.C. Circuit. Not enough experience for the Supreme Court and way too young for the position. So that would not have occurred either, okay? And so because of these reasons, Marshall, had he stepped down under Reagan rather than Bush, he would have gotten a much more liberal, like-minded successor than what he ultimately did. And who knows, the history of a lot of Supreme Court decisions might have been very different. But I would love to see or hear what you have to say about it. So leave them in the comments down below, and I'll be happy to engage in positive, civil, fruitful discussion. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. I got to get to class. I'll talk to you at the next video. Professor Shelton, the Blue Collar Scholar, out.